So where we're up to is we've spoken a fair amount about key elements of how you learn Gemorah and language structures and key phrases that help you to navigate what's going on next in the Gemorah. Jeff, I don't have any spares.
Come share with me.
What I can do though is I can pull it up over here and then okay. So what we're going to look at over here tonight is key halachic principles, and what I mean by that is not key halachic principles to know how halacha works. But these are phrases, they are, as you can see, they are pairs of phrases that always work as the two sides of a scenario. Now, the reason we're doing this is because, remember, a Mishnah is generally going to be talking about something halachic. So, and then the Gemorah is going to develop that, and the Gemorah is going to assess it, and the Gemorah is going to comment and debate, etc., etc. But it's all going to begin with some kind of an halachic position. So these four pairs are essentially the four kinds of halachic issues that you can anticipate are going to come up in the Gemorah. So before we look at the list, let's just think between ourselves. What kind of language or what kind of definitions can you think of in terms of the halachic ruling about something? You know, it's like, and just think even in your own experience, like what are words that we use to express an halachic view about something?
Allowed.
There you go, allowed. Okay? Allowed, what would be the opposite? Forbidden. Okay? So that's one area of halacha, is things that are permitted versus things that are forbidden. So that's why we're learning this, because we want to understand the categories of what it is that we're going to be debating in halacha. So there would be a big issue. Is the following permitted or is the following forbidden? Good. Okay. What else? What would be similar to that?
Kosher, non-kosher.
Excellent. Right? Kosher and non-kosher. Now, that is not going to be as simple as we imagine. Okay? So we're going to get to that. So you have permitted versus forbidden, and you have kosher versus non-kosher. We're going to have to understand what non-kosher is. Good. What else? Anything else that comes to mind? Without cheating, without looking. I mean, if you look, you'll know, but I just want to see if it comes to mind.
Like a Torah law or a
Not so much, because again, it's going to be a Torah law about whether it's permitted or forbidden. It's going to be a Torah law about, or a rabbinic law, whether it's forbidden, right? There is an important point that you're alluding to,
Oral or written.
right? Same concept. Yeah. Oral or written is the same as Torah or rabbinic, but that is going to be relevant. It's going to be relevant to something that we're discussing. Okay.
So when would this be used?
All over.
No, so you learn your Gemorah.
No, you're starting with a Mishnah, right?
Okay.
So the Mishnah is going to say, Rabbi Yehuda says this, and Rabbi Meir says that. Now the words that they're going to use for this and that are going to belong to these four pairs.
He says permissible, he says not.
Correct.
Okay.
He's going to say permissible, he's going to say forbidden, right? As an example. He's going to say kosher, he's going to say not kosher. You'll notice I'm dodging the word. That is the flip side of kosher. Okay, so we'll get there.
Right.
I'm dodging the word deliberately, and we'll get there. Okay? All right. Pure and impure. There we go. Big subject in Judaism. Is something pure or impure? Okay? Very, very important.
Is that related to the temple? Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see exactly what that means. And there's one other, which I'm glad nobody's mentioned, because it's a big subject in its own right, and we'll get there, and it's the last one on the list. So let's have a look at the list. So the four pairs are kosher and, what's the word? Not treif. Pasul. Okay? We're going to have to understand what that is. Then we have the words tahor and tamei. Right? What does tahor mean? What does tahor mean? Pure. And tamei is impure. Good. Then we have the words mutar and asur. So mutar, asur is forbidden. So mutar is permitted. Great. And then we have the words patur and chayav. So what do those mean? Good. We're going to leave that one undefined at this point. Now, there's a big misunderstanding about what kosher means. And if we're going to learn properly, we're going to have to obviously resolve that misunderstanding. So, if I were to ask you, what does the word kosher mean? I know exactly what you're going to say, but go ahead and say it. What does kosher mean?
Clean.
Permitted, right? That's how everybody translates kosher. Permitted. Because what you're thinking is, if it's kosher, I'm permitted to eat it. Which is correct. It's just not the translation of the word kosher. Okay? This is really important. So, let's use an example. Can you think outside of the world of food, can you think of anywhere else that you are familiar with where we use the word kosher to describe, thank you, tefillin. Your tefillin are kosher, right?
You're not eating.
And you're not eating them.
Business Jewish.
And kosher doesn't mean permitted.
Is that colloquial or is that?
No, that's accurate. That's actual.
Colloquial
Okay.
is business Jewish.
Yes, colloquial we'll say not so kosher, right? But in real black and white halachic terms, your tefillin are kosher. That has nothing to do with being permitted. Why would I need my tefillin to be permitted? Food, I get it, right? Food has to be prepared in a particular way, and then it's permitted, so I can understand where that goes. But tefillin are surely holy and beautiful and spiritual. So why would the word mean permitted? Okay, good, great example. Can you think of another example?
Mezuzah.
Mezuzah, right? So mezuzah and tefillin we're going to put into the same category. So whatever kosher means in the context of a mezuzah or tefillin is going to be whatever it is. It's going to be the same. Great. What else? The Eruv, right? So you have an Eruv that is kosher and an Eruv that is not kosher. Great. Great example. So obviously it doesn't mean permitted. So what does it mean? The Eruv makes something permitted, right? If the Eruv is kosher, then we're permitted to carry. But it doesn't actually make, right? It doesn't actually make it permitted, right? There's something.
Checks all the boxes, the law boxes.
Okay, so kosher means it checks all the law boxes. Okay, hold that thought. Hold it. Can you give me any other examples?
Maybe
Sukkah, thank you. That's what I was waiting for. A sukkah. So if your sukkah is within certain dimensions, then it is kosher. And if your sukkah is not within those dimensions, then it is pasul. And if your sukkah has enough coverage from the schach that there's more shade than light, then it is kosher. And if your sukkah is sparse and there's not enough schach that the sun dominates the sukkah, then it is pasul. Great example. Okay.
Which is the same for a mikvah.
Excellent. A mikveh, 100%. So you need to have a kosher mikveh. We use that expression, right? A kosher mikveh. Great. So what does kosher mean? Can't mean permitted.
Halachically correct.
Halachically compliant, right? You said ticks all the boxes, right? That's what it sounds like, right? Halachically compliant. That's what it sounds like, right? Kosher means halachically. And that's pretty close. That's pretty close. So let's throw a spanner in the works. Okay? You ready for this? If kosher, if I say something is kosher, what would I use as a variation of the word kosher to say the means of assigning it as kosher? In other words, if food is kosher,
Process.
if food is kosher, what's the word that I use to let you know that that food has been designated kosher? What's it got? It's got something. A hechsher, right? Hechsher. So what's a hechsher? Something that, you see? So we translate the word hechsher as a stamp of approval, which is inaccurate. Hechsher actually describes a process. The sign tells us the process happened. So it's slang for us to call the sign a hechsher. Hechsher is actually the process. So you ready for this? Here's the spanner in the works. One of the laws that we are not familiar with, because it's very much associated with the temple times, is in the laws of purity and impurity. We know that there are certain things that are susceptible to become impure and certain things that are not susceptible to become impure. So, by the way, it relates to a sukkah as well. Because in order to have a kosher sukkah, the schach may not be susceptible to impurity. So the way that you put it, that you design your schach, it cannot be susceptible to impurity. Okay? So I don't get overly specific about all the various ways that things could be susceptible. We're going to use one example. Okay? The one example is anything which is natural and grows either from the ground or on a tree or whatever the case is, cannot be susceptible to impurity while it is still growing. because that would be ridiculous, right? Then every tree, every blade of grass, it would all be impure. It would be impossible, for example, for a kohen to go anywhere. Or in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, if you wanted to go into the temple and you walked and there was a tree, right, okay. I'm not saying that's the reason, I'm just saying that's the practical application. So the Torah says really clearly that anything, as long as it's still growing, cannot become impure. It's not susceptible to impurity. Let's say now that I've got, just for argument's sake, wheat. So I now harvest the wheat. Is it now susceptible to become impure because it's no longer growing?
But
Based on the information I've given you.
Growing long enough till you cut it?
Really?
I don't know. Still got to be fits in.
If it's in the 7th year,
Yeah, it doesn't matter when it is. Just say, okay, you'll have to speak to a botanist and find out whether or not it can actually grow. Okay, so the thing is, you've cut the wheat, right? Is it now susceptible to impurity? Based on the information I've given you, yes, but I haven't given you all the information. So here, Pinchas has the information that what? Correct. 2 steps in order to make natural produce susceptible to impurity. Step 1 is it has to be cut from its source. Step 2, it has to be exposed to liquid. And there are 7 kinds of liquid. Okay? Which means I cut the wheat and then it rains. From this point forward, the wheat could become impure. Even if it's dry at the time of contact with something impure, it doesn't matter. It was once wet, it was exposed to one of the 7 liquids. It is now, you ready for it? The liquids are a hechsher letuma. Now we've translated hechsher as what? A stamp of approval, right? Like the kosher stamp. But now the expression that's used in the Mishnah and the Gemorah is that this is hechsher letuma. Tuma means impurity. So what are you saying? Now that it got wet, it's now got a stamp of approval for impurity. That's not really a meaningful or useful way to translate it. So what does hechsher mean?
process.
Processed. That's good. Okay. That might be a process. Okay. So Cliff's point about being supervised is really good. And about being processed is really good. Supervision might be the process that is required for certain things, like kosher food. But in this case, nobody had a supervisor. We just had to know that it got wet at some point, right? So what does hechsher mean? It means essentially preparation for, right? Preparation for impurity, preparation for eating, preparation for dipping and purifying things in a mikveh. If my tefillin are kosher, means they've been prepared properly to be able to service the mitzvah. That's actually what the word kosher means. Kosher means suitable for its purpose. That's what kosher actually means. So what does pasul mean?
Not suitable.
Unsuitable for its purpose. Unsuitable for its purpose. Okay?
People saying that meat is pasul, or do you?
No, you don't. You do not, and that's a really good point. We do not use the expression that the meat is pasul, and there's a very specific reason for that. So, why would, let's say meat, because that's the most common, right? And everything else is language that's derived, I'm saying around kashrus, all other language is basically derived out of meat. Okay? What could make meat from a kosher animal land up being non-kosher meat? Because if it's a non-kosher animal, do you know what we call that? No. If it's a non-kosher animal, we call it tameh. Impure. It's not impure with all the ramifications of other kinds of impurity, but that's the category it belongs in. If it is inherently not kosher, because the species is an unclean species, we call that tameh, not treif. We, colloquially, in today's world, throw around the word treif as a catch-all for any kind of forbidden food. But that's not correct. And it's just that's become the language, and nobody's going to change that. But when I'm studying Gemorah, I should not expect to see the word treif ever. The closest I'll get the word treifa. So I'll go back to my question. If an animal is a kosher animal, what could make the meat no longer kosher?
Kill the crow.
wasn't killed appropriately. So if it was not killed in the specified manner that the Torah mandates, then it is what we call a nevela. The direct translation of a nevela is a carcass. So it's the difference between meat and a carcass.
Either way, you can't eat it, but that's
If it's nevela, you may not eat it. So the animal is a kosher, or as we call it, a tahor animal. It's a pure animal. But the process didn't work out properly. So it is now not kosher. It's not usable. It's not suitable for eating because something went wrong with the process. It wasn't killed in the correct fashion. Okay? Now, why don't we call it pasul? I'm getting there in 1 second. Give me another reason. No, because tameh means it's inherently. I'm saying in the case of food, not in the case of other kinds of impurity, but in the case of food, tameh is inherently from day dot something which is off limits, as opposed to something that whatever went awry and now is not off limits. Okay, so what's the other possibility? The first possibility is it wasn't killed in the correct manner, and therefore it is nevela, and I'm not allowed to eat it. What else could ruin it? There we go, the lungs. So wasn't prepared would be part of the nevela thing. The lungs, in other words. And it's not only lungs, just lungs are the most well-known part of the process, but we are obligated by Torah to examine an animal after it has been shechted to ensure that the animal was in decent enough health that it could have lived another year. If there's anything that shows me it could not have lived another year, that is no longer kosher. That, which could either be an injury or an illness. That's why they check lungs, because lungs very often have disease, and you can detect that disease post-mortem, and you can check if it had healthy lungs or not. Whereas injury, typically you'd see before the animal was slaughtered. You'd be able to tell it's an animal that can't hold its head up, or it's got a missing limb, or whatever the case is. Those are things you can examine before you slaughter. But if it's a disease, you'll only typically find that out after you've shechted the animal. And it's not only the lungs that have to be checked, but most commonly we check the lungs because they tend to have the greatest issues. So, and it's very interesting because like in today's world, we talk about mad cow disease and avian flu and all these things, and you see how it was all about the lungs. Very interesting. Anyway, so the point is, if an animal is not going to survive the year, the Torah calls that animal treifa. The actual meaning of the word treifa is that it's been mauled by a predator. That's the actual meaning of the word treifa. Because the most common way that people's animals were injured in those days was a predator that got into the pen. So that's the Torah speaks about it. Basar basode treifa lo yisachelu lakelev tashlichon oisoi. That if you have meat in the field, so a field means it's exposed to predators, treifa that has been mauled, you may not eat it. You're supposed to give it to the dogs. It's very interesting. That's where we have the Torah precedent that there's a concept of feeding dogs. It's not just because you have a pet. It's actually a concept in Judaism. Okay? So we, as a society, over centuries, we slangified the word treifa into treif, which is basically we now use generically to represent anything we're not permitted to eat. But the Gemorah is not going to do that. The Gemorah is not going to use the word treif. The Gemorah is going to use the word asur. It's going to tell you that it's forbidden. And that's where we're going to distinguish here between pasul and asur. Pasul means no longer suitable for its purpose. Asur means forbidden for me to partake of. So food doesn't have a purpose per se. It's not like tefillin that have a purpose in order to serve a ritual, right? In which case you'd say pasul, it can no longer serve that purpose. The minute we're dealing with food, the question is it mutar? Is it something I'm permitted to eat? Or is it asur, something I'm forbidden to eat? So the whole concept of kosher is not going to be used in the Gemorah in the context of food that we eat. Ever. It's only going to be used in the context of, is your sukkah suitable for use? Is your mikveh suitable for use? Are your tefillin suitable for use? That's when you're going to, is this animal suitable to be brought as a sacrifice? So let's say in order to bring an animal as a sacrifice, it has to be free of blemish. If I find that it has a particular blemish, and there's a whole long list of blemishes that could disqualify an animal, then I will say this animal is now pasul, not suitable for service. I'm not going to say, oh, so it's not forbidden. Forbidden is relative to me and my consumption. And kosher and pasul is relative to a role and whether or not you can fulfill the role. Here's another example. You ready for this? Here's another example. So here's a guy, and they used to do this on an annual basis. In the Beis Hamikdash, they used to have an intake of the new Kohanim who had to come in, and they would have to do some research on the Kohen, both in terms of family background and in terms of their physical fitness.
They're left-handed.
Exactly. Right? So you have two things. There are two ways. It's a nice trivia question. How can you disqualify a Kohen from service in the temple, right? So there are two possible ways. Either the pedigree is wrong, or they have a blemish. In the same way as an animal can have a blemish, a Kohen can also have a blemish that would disqualify the Kohen from service. So a short-sighted Kohen, sorry, right? That's it. Ois, can't serve. Left-handed Kohen, can't serve.
I'm out.
You're out.
How you lefty?
Yeah.
So we call that pasul likahuna. They are disqualified from Kohenship.
Oh, welcome to
Right?
our
So-
mundane life.
No, they're apostle from service. They're not. So that you can't. Sorry. There's apostle. There's apostle la avoida. They are disqualified from service, which is the lefty. Apostle likohuna, disqualified as a kohen, is the father married a divorcee, and this is the child. So now they lose all of their status as a kohen. Right? Exactly. So, but can you see how the word apostle works? Apostle has nothing to do with my personal use or consumption. Apostle has to do with whether something is suited to its particular role or not.
So you
Kosher is it suited to its role or not? Even if the role is not a positive role, like kosher l'tumah, it is now suitable to become impure. We won't use the apostle. You don't use that. Apostle l'tumah doesn't make any sense.
So you use the 4 blocks basically together.
No. I'm making a
it
big
can be-
distinction.
Kosher, asur.
I'm making
Kosher but forbidden.
that's my whole point over here. Making a big distinction. We'll use the word kosher when we're referring to whether things are suited to their roles,
Yes. That's what I'm
and
saying.
pasul when they're not suited. Whereas mutar and asur will be talking about whether I'm allowed to partake of them or not.
Okay.
So the minute I'm saying kosher pasul, it's got nothing to do with me. It's about whether it's for Hashem or
You
for
still
service.
benefit from it if it's
Mutter is
possible.
you can.
Well, good question. Can you? We're
what's
going to get.
mutter?
We're still going to get to mutter. Don't worry. We're still going to get there. So, pasul, can you still benefit from something that is pasul under certain circumstances? Absolutely. So, for example, if I dedicated an animal to be a sacrifice, and then when we get there, it turns out that it's disqualified. Like while we were walking, something happened to it, got injured, got blemished, or whatever the case is. Now it's pasul le korban. It is now disqualified for sacrifice. I can't use it because it's been dedicated to Hashem. The Beis Hamikdash can't use it because it's pasul. That animal now goes literally out to pasture. That's, and that's it. Lives out the rest of its days and nobody can touch it. You basically got to leave it to the elements. Okay?
Can you refer to food as mutter?
Yes, food will always be referred to as mutar or asur.
But do people do that?
They should. And in the frum world, you'll probably hear that expression much more than in the generic colloquial term. Okay, we're still going to get there. Okay, but yes, absolutely. So if I had to look in the Shulchan Aruch, in the laws of, again, I'm going to use the generic term kashrus, I'm going to see always mutar or asur. Those are going to be the words. Okay, but we'll get there. We're still going to get there. Here's another example. An example that we actually touched on in the wee hours of Shavuos morning. A gambler is pasul le'edus,
That's the only reference to it.
right? Disqualified from testifying in a court of law. This is not an indictment on the person's character, even though there are commentaries and there is an opinion in the Gemorah that says that they're essentially considered crooks. But that aside, pasul le'edus just tells me they are not suitable for a particular role. What's the role? To testify in court. In order to testify in court, you have to be a reliable, upstanding citizen. And we assume that somebody who's involved as a professional gambler, and most of the commentaries say it's professional gambling, is not a productive, upstanding member of society. And so they are pasul le'edus. They are not permitted to testify. Likewise, by the way, just going back a second to the Kohen, so a divorcee is somebody who is pasul likahunam, is disqualified from marrying a Kohen. You could use the same expression, right? Pasul le, disqualified from a particular role. Okay, so let's be clear. Kosher and pasul means suitable or unsuitable for a purpose. Okay? Good? Clear? Makes sense? So if I don't have enough schach on my sukkah, it is pasul, it doesn't work as a sukkah. Okay. All right. We're now going to skip tahor and tameh and go to mutar and asur first, because that's obviously come up a lot in the conversation. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll go back to the others. Okay, so mutar and asur. Now, in the same way as what we did over here, is we said kosher, if you go to its real translation, the real translation of the word kosher means suitable as opposed to edible, right? So quite a useful distinction. So in the same way, we want to get to the core of what these two words mean, mutar and asur, because, believe it or not, these are actually not halachic terms in and of themselves. Kosher and pasul are very much halachic terms. Like, we wouldn't really have another arena to use these words, other than the slang of, it's not so kosher, right? That we could say. But the words asur and mutar are words that are used extensively outside of the halachic realm, including every single morning of our lives in the morning brachas. So we have 18 brachas that we say every single morning to thank Hashem for various aspects of our lives, right? Pokeach Ivrim, that Hashem allows us to see, etc. In there are these two words, one of those brachas. Watching the wheels turn in everybody's heads. Thank you. Matir Asurim. Right? Every single morning, that's what we say. Baruch atah Hashem, Matir Asurim. What does that mean? He permits the forbidden. Because mutar is permitted and asur is forbidden. So is that what we're saying every single morning? I don't think we'd be praising God for that. We'd be praising the liberal rabbi for that. Saying he's permitting the forbidden. So what does it mean, matir asurim? No? What does it mean? Releases the bound. In Hebrew, a prison, in modern Hebrew, you call prison kele. But the more kind of outdated version, which is also the version you find in the Torah itself, like in the story of Joseph. So the story is that he's put into Beis Ha'asurim. That's a prison. A base is a building or a house, but of asurim, of people who are bound. The house of the bound. Because that's actually what the word means. It means to be bound, to be tied up. Right, exactly. And even today, the word for a prisoner is an asir. Is a prisoner. Okay? Now, if you go and ask for a loophole, let's just say, so there's a particular issue, and you want to ask the shaila to the rabbi, and you're hoping that the rabbi is going to give you a lenient answer. What do we call the lenient answer? A heter. Heter, right? Mutar, heter, same word. Asur, asir, same word. So asur means bound, and an asir is the prisoner, in other words, the person who is bound, and the place that holds them is called the Beis Ha'asurim. So the opposite of being bound is being released, untied. So when I'm asking for a heter, when I go ask the rabbi, I need to be allowed to do something, what am I basically saying? Unshackle me from this law. That's basically what I'm saying. Right? I'm looking for a heter. I'm looking for a way out. It's like right now I'm stuck because this is the law. So I'm looking for a release. Literally. Okay?
I did it for charging interest.
Heter, excellent. Heter iska, right? Permission to charge a service fee in lieu of interest, right? Exactly. Here's another one. Erev Rosh Hashanah, after Shachris, what do? Annulment of vows. What is that called? Hataras Nedarim. A neder is a vow or promise. So hataras, the release of promises, of vows. Okay? So what does that tell you? That basically tells you in plain English, if something is asur, it's like it's been locked away and I can't partake of it. If something is mutar, it's as if it's been released and therefore I can partake of it. So that contextualizes for you that when I'm using words like mutar and asur, I'm using them in the context of whether I may or may not partake. Is it open for me or is it closed from me? Just by the way, Chassidus takes this a step deeper. Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe explains in the 6th chapter of Tanya that the way Hashem designed the world is that there are 3 spiritual realities. There's a spiritual reality called Kedusha. How do you translate Kedusha? Holiness. And then there's a spiritual reality called Klippa. How do you translate Klippa? Covered, right? Concealed, blocked, right? Any term like that. The direct translation of a Klippa is a peel or a shell, right? So anything that is blocked by a shell, that's housed in a shell. Okay? So the Alter Rebbe explains that the word asur means that it is tied to the Klippa. Klippa is always associated with something which is negative, spiritually negative. And if the Torah tells me that something is asur, that means it is bound to the Klippa. That's why I can't access it. Because it just picture for a moment like you're deep, let's call it like 30 meters deep in the ocean. And there's something that looks very attractive, but it's tied to a boulder. Then if you're going to try to take that item, it's going to endanger you. Because it's tied to something toxic. It's tied to something unhealthy. The word mutar, he explains, is that it is not bound to the klippa, and therefore I have an opportunity to use it and turn it into something holy. Okay? So, for example, in the way that the Alter Rebbe is explaining it, if there is an animal that is a Tomei, as we're now translating it, right? An impure animal that is stuck in the world of impurity. There's nothing I can do with all the effort in the world to release it. So rather than me being able to use it as a catalyst for growth, it's going to suck me down into something unhealthy. Whereas if there's an animal that is a kosher animal, that means it's mutar. It is available for upgrade. And my job as a Jewish person is to upgrade it. So that's like a deeper understanding of what these words asur and mutar mean. But effectively, that's what it is. It means permissible or forbidden. So, that could apply to things, or it could apply to behaviors. So let's use an example. Chometz on Pesach is asur. Okay? Chometz on Pesach is asur. It's forbidden. It's completely forbidden. Bread for the rest of the year is mutar. Mutar. Okay? Is permitted the rest of the year. Now what's fascinating about that is that that's an illustration of something where it's not whether the item is asur or mutar, it's the context that makes it asur or mutar. Fascinating, right? Here's another example. We're all sitting together at a meal. One of us, for whatever reason, decided to become a nazir. So what are the rules of a nazir? What was the first thing you said?
Cutting up hair.
Oh, I thought you said 2 things, something and hair. Okay, so he may not cut his hair is one of the rules of the nazir. What's another rule of the nazir? He may not have any grape product. It's not only drinking wine. May not have any grape derivative. So we're sitting at the table, and there's a bottle of wine on the table. Is the wine kosher in our colloquial usage of the word kosher? Or even in the halachic, meaning suitable to drink? Is it? Yes, it is. Right? Is the wine mutar?
Yes.
Is the wine permissible? Yes, intrinsically it is absolutely mutar. In his context, the same wine that is intrinsically mutar, because of his choice and his circumstances, that wine is asur for him. So that tells you that it's about me, right? My usage, my consumption. It's a whole lot more personal than whether I'm saying this is pure or impure, or saying this is kosher or pasul. This could be wholly personal. Or, another example of the same kind of thing, We're all sitting at the table, and Dion just got a fresh delivery of truma, because he's a Kohen. So he got a fresh delivery of truma that he's sitting and eating, and we're all salivating over his truma that he's eating. For him, it is mutar, obviously, because he's a Kohen. He's permitted to eat the truma. And we are not Kohanim, so for us, the same food is asur for us. Okay? Let's try a different example. That's not a food example. Am I, as a Jewish person, permitted to use electricity? Yes. So electricity is mutar, fundamentally. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with electricity. It is mutar. And on Shabbos, the same behavior on a different day is now asur. So the context could determine whether something is mutar or asur. Okay? Now, without getting overly complicated, let's just throw one other thing at you just to make this fun. Okay? Just to make this fun. You ready?
But I mean, on the electricity, if you got a time switch, it's still mutter.
It's correct. Correct, exactly. Exactly. Personal consumption. Right? I, on Shabbos, am in a position that I may not operate electricity. Electricity, correct. Electricity is not fundamentally bad. Exactly right. So it's asur for me. Okay, here. So now let's make this fun. If I have a pot of cholent with what do we put in cholent?
Kosher meat.
Thank you, meat. A fleishike cholent, right? I have a fleishike cholent, and I've put in some nice lamb inside the cholent. Is this cholent mutar? Yes. But then somebody accidentally spills some milk into the cholent. What's the rule?
If it's just a drop,
What?
And it's still mutter.
Depends. The correct answer is it depends. How much milk? Right? So, the rule is 60 to 1, right? So if the quantity of milk that went into the cholent pot was less than 60 of the volume of all of the cholent, then the cholent is mutar. And if the quantity of milk that went in was more than a 60th of the volume of the cholent, then the cholent becomes asur. Let's change the story a little bit, because here's where it's going to get fun.
Pasul and
Not pasul. It's not pasul.
well, it's unsuitable for purpose now.
Agreed. But pasul always talks about when it has a purpose to serve. Asur talks about when it services me. Okay?
Yeah, but it's got no purpose to serve if it's not.
I'm saying cholent to start with is not something that is designated for a ritualistic purpose. So pasul is not the right word for it. Right? It's designated for human, for personal purpose. Therefore, mutar and asur are the right words to use for it. Okay? So you ready for this? It's Pesach, and I'm making a cholent. And somehow, a breeze comes through the window, carrying a little breadcrumb that's made with the most incredible snowflake flour that it can literally fly through the air because it's so light. And this tiny little breadcrumb now falls into the cholent and immediately dissolves.
Who saw it? That's what I want.
I don't know who saw it. And immediately dissolves in.
You got the story of the Chassid who's just got married.
Chef Ryan
And he's eating his soup in his
Chef Ryan.
Schwer's house at the Seder table, and he suddenly sees
Yeah.
a whole barley grain inside, and he goes mad. And he attacks his father-in-law, and then they go upstairs to the Rebbe, who lives in the same block of apartment block, and the Rebbe says, "Give me a strime." And he shakes it up.
Yeah.
They throw barley at the wedding.
At the wedding. And it fell out of his shtreimel into the thing. Exactly.
That was seen.
The big question about that story, by the way, because there's a whole argument to say that throwing barley at a wedding is a pagan practice and Jews never did it. But anyhow, whatever. It's a good story. It's a good. It's a good story. So okay, so the amount of breadcrumb that falls into this cholent is less than 1,000th of the volume of the cholent. Is the cholent asur or mutar? Asur. Why?
Because they're just going opposite from your previous example.
So it's very, very interesting. There's two reasons. The one is because the Torah is so specific about the fact that you may not find any chometz in your house. But the other is because we have a broader principle which says, if something will become mutar later, there's no reason for us to give you a heter now. In other words, in a few days, Pesach will be over. And once Pesach is over, Chometz is no longer an issue. So there is a time where you'd be technically allowed to eat the cholent. Okay, practically you have to check out the cholent before you get there. Fine. But in principle, this food is not something that is asur inherently. It's only asur in the now. Therefore, we're not going to give you any leeway to make it usable in the now if later there's a way to make it usable anyway.
You mean to keep it and eat it later?
For Pesach, you can't do that because chametz you have to get rid of immediately. But I'm just sharing the principle, right? The principle is that if something does become mutter at a later point, then that will escalate how asur it is in the period that it is asur, because why make life easier for you if you could have it later? Another example of the same kind of thing would be, let's say that somebody comes into your house and does something which you're not supposed to do on Shabbos on your behalf. So we'd have the same kind of argument. We would say, well, listen, after Shabbos, there's no restriction on using it, so why should we make it accessible to you now, if now it's in an asur state and later will be in a mutter state? Okay, just throwing that out there. It's an interesting principle, but it basically speaks to this concept of asur and mutter. There's one other really important thing we have to know about the word mutter. The word mutter implies it is allowed without any qualms. Okay? Allowed without any qualms. So let's just be clear about this. There are certain things that people who don't know enough about Shabbos, for example, people will say you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos, right? It's the easiest thing in the world to say you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos, especially if you don't know what you're talking about. Let's just err on the side of caution, right? So, for example, many years ago, we had a woman who worked in our house, and she told the kids that you're not permitted to flush the toilet on Shabbos. I don't know what gave her that idea, and thank God we were able to find out and put an end to that. But the point is, right, if you don't know, you can... So there are things on Shabbos that are asur, that are outright forbidden. There are things on Shabbos that are potter, which we haven't yet discussed, so we'll come back to that. Okay? Potter does not mean it's allowed. It's a funny category. That's why we have to give it its own attention. And then there are things on Shabbos that are mutter, that you do not have to hesitate. They're 100% acceptable. So that's what we have to know about the word. Mutter doesn't just mean we're allowing you access or allowing you the chance to behave in a certain way or eat a certain food. Mutter means without qualms, without hesitation, without gray areas. It's 100% clear. And we need to know that. Because anytime that word mutter is going to pop up, you need to know that this is, it's guilt-free. I had a meal recently with somebody at a kosher restaurant, and they were like, they were saying, we're eating guilt-free. You can order anything on the menu and eat guilt-free, right? So that's really what mutter means. Mutter means that there's absolutely no hesitation. There's absolutely no issues. Okay, and it's really important to know that, because sometimes when we ask a shaila and we get a response from the rabbi, we want to know, am I getting a response that is essentially saying, listen, it's not ideal, but, or is the rabbi saying, mutter, no hesitation? So the person who's got diabetes, when the rabbi tells them, eat on Yom Kippur, that is mutter. It's not a loophole, that is mutter. This is 100% what you have to do. Okay, I specifically didn't use the example of calling the emergency services on Shabbos, because that's even more than mutter. That becomes mitzvah, right? That's even higher, like a more compelling kind of thing that you have to do. Okay, so that leaves us with the conversation still about tahor and tameh, and the biggie, which is chayav and potter, which please God we'll do next time.